I stopped playing the mainline Pokemon games with X and Y. I recently played through some of the old Pokemon games, and there are glaring problems with the games that make them less desirable to play now. That got me thinking about how I would design a Pokemon-like game that I would want to play today. That was the inspiration for the next game I am developing, Picopals. Picopals is a creature collection game that's designed to address my problems with the Pokemon series. My first problem with Pokemon and other RPGs is structural. RPGs have two game flavors in combat, regular battles and bosses. In most RPGs, bosses represent the climax of a section of gameplay defined by a series of regular battles. In Pokemon, the boss battles are represented by gym leaders, and regular battles are sprinkled throughout the routes. What this structure necessarily results in is regular battles being easy. This is because to battle multiple enemies in a gauntlet requires the individual enemies to be weak enough to battle in succession. The regular battle game flavor is more about long-term survivability and stocking up on healing items than difficult battles. This section of Pokemon is undercut by the fact that the player is able to return to the Pokemon Center at any time to heal their Pokemon. This is a real-world time resource and not a game resource. In other words, the only reason to continue through a gauntlet of regular battles is to save time not returning to a Pokemon Center. This problem can be fixed by simply returning all creatures to their full health after every battle, which is how Picopals works. This way, every battle could be with a high-level enemy, and every battle can feel like a boss. Healing after every battle is a feature of some RPGs, like Xenoblade Chronicles for example. In Xenoblade, even basic enemies are formidable because any battle can exhaust the player's resources. The feature works in addition to a change in how enemy parties are filled. Replaying Pokemon just to fight through a gauntlet of low-level starting area bugs is not fun. Picopals will have diverse enemy parties in type and species that make every battle interesting. Removing Pokemon Centers speeds up the game because the player doesn't have to constantly return to heal their party, and that touches on another problem with Pokemon, speed. Pokemon is simply too slow. Playing on an emulator, there is a speed up feature that can be mapped to a controller button that massively makes the game more playable, but it shouldn't be necessary to have a speed up feature. This is why I want to design a fast-paced and short game that delivers creature collecting gameplay in a tight package. I'm designing the battle system to not have any text that needs to be clicked through. All battle information is delivered through quick pop-ups, and all battle animations are hard-coded to be a second long. The player should be in and out of battles quickly and progress through the content at the speed they choose to play at. Another problem with Pokemon is that the type system is too complicated and requires memorization. As a kid, I had the type system memorized, but returning to the games, I found it difficult to remember every type combination's effectiveness level. The starters of grass, fire, and water teach the most intuitive type combinations, and that makes logical sense. Fire burns grass, which doesn't require much to remember, but that fire is weak to dragon is completely memorization. With 18 types, the level of memorization is a barrier to play. This is why I'm designing Picopals to have a type system based on a visual structure. In Picopals, the 8 types associated with colors are arranged in a color wheel with type effectiveness in battle corresponding to clockwise movement. What this accomplishes is the removal of any memorization. The types can be worked out simply by knowing the order of the colors on a color wheel, and there are no exceptions to this rule. I also made a major change to how types work. In Picopals, any Picopal can be any type. This is because the types are not linked to objective representations like fire or steel, but instead abstract colors. In this system, the types are more like personalities that the Picopals can have, and this determines what moves they can learn. I think this system will allow an increased diversity of play as Picopal species can be mixed and matched with different types. There are also items that allow the player to change the type of their Picopal. Every Picopal is like an Eevee, which can change into any type. My aim at making a quick game also entails eliminating tall grass from the monster collecting equation. This is because random encounters slow down the game, and the randomness at which they appear is frustrating for a player just trying to get to the next location. Instead of catching wild creatures in tall grass, in Picopals, mystery Picopals can be found in the Overworld and caught. This also limits the player's ability to fill their team. Without a Pokemon Center equivalent, there is no box to place your creatures in. Instead, the player's party is a living entity that grows as mystery Picopals are discovered and caught. Picopals can be discarded from the party to make room for caught Picopals. I'm not the only person who wants Pokemon to be more difficult, as evidenced by the existence of Nuzlockes. Nuzlockers play Pokemon with an altered rule set to make the games more difficult. I took inspiration from Nuzlockes to determine how the creature collecting formula can be improved. For one, like in Nuzlockes, all Picopals must be given a nickname. In fact, Picopals don't even have official species names and can only be referred to by their nicknames. This increases the bond of the player to the Picopals, and also makes it easier for me not having to come up with clever names for all the Picopals. In my initial draft of Picopals, I thought I would incorporate permanent death into the game to match with how Nuzlockes work, but I scrapped that idea. Permadeath did not work well with the other systems of the game. In Picopals, when the player enters a new town or area, they are confronted with trainers who can be taken on in any order. A preview of the team appears before the battle is accepted. This way, the player can take on enemies in the order of their choosing, or choose to take on difficult battles early. The permadeath mechanic disincentivizes players from taking on difficult battles just for fun. Permanent death is a solution to the regular battle gauntlets being too easy, but is actually against competitive playstyles. In competitive Pokemon, you don't attempt to never have a Pokemon faint, but instead accept fainting as part of the battle. Because I want every battle to feel like a boss, permadeath doesn't work. I started off the project using GameMaker Studio 2. I hadn't used the engine in 2 years, as I've been using Unity in that time. I thought it would be good for a simple 2D game like Picopals, so I watched some tutorials to refresh myself on the engine. I released my first major game, Hermit Home Designer, using GameMaker, and it was a great learning tool. What I love about GameMaker is how the editor is set up and integrated into the game design. You code directly on objects with built-in events for game logic. Objects appear on the same editor space as other assets, which organizes your thoughts out visually. As much as I love GameMaker, there are things I noticed this time around having other engine experience that soured the experience. The main problem I kept getting was inaccurate error highlighting in the code editor. In particular, I kept getting an error saying that the functions I were using accepted no parameters even though they did. Hovering over the underlined code didn't display why the error was occurring. There was also problems like how the room editor would constantly reset its grid value to the default 32 pixels even though I kept manually setting them to be 100. There is no text wrap in the editor, and the autocomplete isn't as good as in Visual Studio, which makes it hard to write out long descriptive variable and method names, which I like to do. You also can't start the game from the current open room/scene, which is an annoyance for playtesting. Overall, in GameMaker, I made a basic prototype with overworld movement on a grid, Picopals with stats and moves, and battles. This is where I started to receive multiple bugs that I simply couldn't find an explanation for. Out of frustration, I decided to start from scratch in Unity and migrate all of my work. This is my third time migrating a project from GameMaker to Unity. I did this with Hermit Home Designer and my most recent game, Well. I've gotten used to Unity and it provides more than GameMaker can. I've spent way more time than I should experimenting with various game engines. I think at this point I need to leave other engines behind and accept that I'm a Unity developer. Focusing my efforts on one engine will be better for me in the long run. For the art style, one thing I knew is that I wasn't going to do pixel art. I didn't want this game to look like just another indie pixel art game, and I wanted to distance myself from Pokemon. But without the scope to make highly detailed or realistic 2D art, I had to get creative. I started by mocking up designs for Picopals in Clip Studio. I came up with 25 that I liked and could use as assets. I then designed the main character. The style that was forming was to use a 100 pixel tile for all sprites and to mostly stick to a single color per sprite. The art style that was forming led me to find a key inspiration for the game. The art style of the game is like an upscaled version of the art from Princess Remedy. My inspiration from Princess Remedy affected both the art style and the structure of the game. Princess Remedy is like a mini RPG with bullet hell battles. My game, Picopals, borrows the structure of the overworld of Princess Remedy and replaces the bullet hell battles with turn-based battles. I also borrowed a mechanic from Princess Remedy in the form of star barriers that need to be broken by gathering enough stars. Stars are obtained by beating trainers. I then went to work in Adobe Illustrator creating vectorized versions of all my designs and some placeholder assets. Because I'm using vector art for the game, I can render out the image for 4K resolution. For the music, I wanted to match the visuals with something that was retro in style but high resolution. I accomplished this by recreating music from a Famine Tracker EP that I made years ago and Reaper using Native Instruments Super 8 synthesizer instead of NES sounds. I paired this with a drum kit from Super Audio Kart. This gives the game an analog retro feel while being higher resolution than chiptunes to match the visuals of the game. That's all the progress on the game I have to report so far. The Steam page is live, so if this project interests you, follow the link in the description to wishlist it. Subscribe for more updates here on YouTube, and follow my X for Screenshot Saturday posts. This has been Ryan9, thank you for watching.